And joining me on the program this morning, the Assistant Treasurer David Bradbury and the Shadow Assistant Treasurer Matthias Cormann. Gentlemen, it's good to see you both. David, I want to ask you first of all, do industries like manufacturing, like tourism, simply have to get used to it? Yesterday, Glenn Stevens made it clear we could face the exchange rate for the foreseeable future if growth continues in Asia.
Well, I think it's likely that the prospect of a high dollar will be something that we will have to live with into the future. But I think it's important to recognise that this is part of one of the structural changes that is occurring within the Australian economy. And I say to all of those people out there actively and productively contributing to these sectors that is exactly why the government strategy of trying to spread the benefits of the mining boom is something that they should be endorsing. We have, and if you look at the national accounts figures last week, which were extraordinary figures, they were the strongest endorsement of the strength of the Australian economy that you could ever ask for. I know that the opposition found it very difficult to even grudgingly acknowledge that, but we have a very strong economy, strong growth, low unemployment, contained inflation, record pipeline of investment. When you've got $500 billion worth of investment coming into our resources sector with a high dollar, now is the time for us to spread the benefits of the resources boom. That's what we're doing. We are delivering a mining tax, a tax that Matthias and his friends will rip away at a time when struggling sectors in other parts of the Australian economy do require a little bit of assistance. The way in which we want to deliver that assistance is through the tax reform measures that we've announced, but also making sure that families have more in their pockets to spend and to support those industries.
On the issue of the tourism industry, though, I'll go to Matthias Cormann in a moment, but tourism for one, do they need to be more adaptable? That was the word used yesterday by Governor Stevens, that whether or not the exchange rate is too high depends on us, whether or not we can improve productivity and whether or not we can be more show more adaptability. Is that something these industries need to do more of?
Well, look, I think that if we want to be the economic powerhouse that we have emerged to become in the global economy today, if we want to stay in the position of economic strength that we have, of course we have to continue to be innovative. We have to make sure that we're flexible and we're able to take advantage of those opportunities. Can I make this point about the opportunities that exist for sectors like the tourism sector? What we're seeing in the resources sector at the moment is largely being driven by demand for our resources from many of our Asian neighbours. What is occurring in these parts of the world, and take China for example, if you look at the growth that's occurring in China, much of that is driven by the process of urbanisation. Just about every year, about 20 million Chinese people are moving from rural parts of China into urban centres. That's what's driving the demand for our resources. But as those people, 20 million people, the equivalent of Australia's population each year, as those people become more upwardly mobile, become more part of the middle class that we would consider the middle class here in Australia, the demand for services that we can provide, such as tourism services in this country, presents an enormous opportunity regardless of where the exchange rate is. So I think it's important that we recognise the opportunities that exist.
Shadow Assistant Treasurer Matthias Cormann joining us in Brisbane. Senator Cormann, tell me your response to Glenn Stevens yesterday and the forum generally, but Stevens particularly talking this economy as being glass half full. He's really advocating the government's message that things aren't so bad and that we're in pretty good shape. That was the general gist of his argument yesterday.
Well, what we saw from the national accounts figures last week was that the national economic growth is driven principally by strong growth out of Western Australia and Queensland, and of course principally through the mining sector. And that is of course that sector of the economy that this government wants to slow down. And our message is that you don't speed up the slow line, you don't help that part of the economy that is finding it more challenging at the moment by slowing down the fast line. The only way that you can actually ensure that our economic growth strengthens over time is by improving productivity, by making sure that we are internationally as competitive as we can be. And of course what we've had from this government is a carbon tax which will make our manufacturing sector less competitive internationally. And of course we've had a government which has choked business in significant additional red tape. 18,000 new regulations over the last 4 years have been introduced by this government, which of course comes at a significant cost. I heard yesterday the Prime Minister try and suggest that somehow she is again committed to company tax cuts after, of course, they scrapped them in the budget. But they've got to be revenue neutral somehow. Well, when she talks about revenue neutral company tax cuts, what she really is saying is that we need to have a tax increase in order to fund a company tax cut. The truth of the matter is that the only way to deliver tax cuts in a sustainable and responsible fashion is by government spending less and by growing the economy more strongly. And of course, those are both areas that the government hasn't been very effective at.
Senator Cormann, Glenn Stevens,
Senator
Cormann, David, you had a fair crack at the start.
Yep.
Senator Cormann, when Glenn Stevens spoke about the Productivity Commission and what it's suggesting in terms of boosting productivity, you heard that message yesterday. Is there anything on there, on that list that he spoke of, that you would instantly say, okay, this is low-hanging fruit, we'll go and do that? Because it does seem to me that a lot of the productivity recommendations, beyond where we are now in terms of skills and boosting training and so on, that a lot of this does remain very, very controversial ground, at least politically.
Well, I mean, we have a 6-point plan to boost productivity growth. I mean, there's no doubt that under this government, productivity growth has slowed down to a trickle. And part of that is, of course, because we've had a government which has spent too much. We've had a government that has imposed more than 20 new or increased taxes. We've had a government that has introduced more than 18,000 new regulations, which is significant additional red tape, which, of course, slows down business. And, of course, we've got a government that is imposing the world's largest carbon tax at the worst possible time. And of course, you know, when you've got a carbon tax which will push up the cost of electricity, and which yet again will push up the cost of doing business in Australia, that is exactly the wrong direction to take Australia in at this point in time when we're facing significant economic storm clouds on the global horizon.
David, when it comes to this notion of a cut in the company tax rate, the Prime Minister has reaffirmed her support for this idea, but as Senator Cormann pointed out, she's saying it's got to be revenue neutral. So if there's going to be a cut there's got to be an increase somewhere else, doesn't it? That's just common sense.
Well, can I make this point? And it's obviously escaped Matthias, but the review of business taxation carried out by the previous government, a Liberal National government, which effectively undertook some significant tax reforms in the corporate sector, that was a package that was revenue neutral. So this suggestion that somehow you can't deliver tax reform within the envelope of the existing tax amounts that are currently collected within the corporate tax sector is just plain wrong. Now, it's not always an easy thing to do, but for Matthias to run this line, in his little spiel a few minutes ago, I counted about 7 or 8 lies, and I think there were probably even more than that. But this notion that we're a big spending government, well, look at what the budget figures show. Over the forward estimates, we will have a sustained period of contained expenditure lower than we've seen in decades. He said we're a high taxing government. 22.1% as a proportion of GDP is where tax levels are at. Lowest that we've had. In fact, at no time during the Howard government was taxation that low. He then went into the area of productivity reforms. Well, let's have a look at what's happened in this country over the last couple of decades. Whether it be the National Competition Principles Agreement, one of the most significant microeconomic reforms this country's seen, Labor government. What about the 27 areas of reform that we've undertaken as deregulation measures to ensure that we have a seamless national economy? Labor government. Who was it that lowered the tariff wall? Labor government. In fact, Matthias might want to tell us exactly what it was that the Liberals did in all of their time in power that contributed towards greater productivity growth. There wasn't a hell of a lot that happened.
Well, I'd say the GST was one thing that at least boosted the efficiency of the tax system, but let's get Matthias Cormann to respond to that.
Would you say that's a productivity growth measure?
10 surplus
Senator
budgets,
Cormann can defend himself
after income tax cut. Sorry?
Senator Cormann, your response, Senator, but also the other thing I'd put to you, and you can respond to this as well, and it is segueing into another issue, but you can feel free to respond to both. This relates to the energy prices. Yesterday we saw announced through IPART, this is New South Wales specific, but I think has relevance more generally. It shows that the carbon tax increase on the power bill is only $3.30 a week. That is less than what the government had predicted. So it shows that the compensation the government's offering is easily enough to cover that component of the power price. Really, your response to that, as well as your reaction to what David Bradbury's had to say this morning.
Well, I mean, the point in relation to the carbon tax is this. Electricity prices go up year on year in order to keep the lights on, in order to keep electricity generation going. But the carbon tax is a self-inflicted additional cost. It is a self-inflicted, unnecessary additional cost. So to the extent that the carbon tax pushes up the cost of electricity, it then also pushes up the cost of living, it pushes up the cost of doing business, it makes us less competitive internationally, and all of that imposing sacrifices without actually making a difference to the environment. And that is really what is upsetting people across Australia. They understand that this is something that is imposing an additional unnecessary sacrifice without actually doing anything to help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. If this was something that actually would make a difference, it would be a totally different debate, but it isn't. And of course, this is the worst possible time to actually impose an additional unnecessary cost that is not going to do anything to help reduce emissions, but that is going to make us less competitive internationally.
When's the best time? When's the best time, Matthias?
The appropriate time, if you wanted to go down this path,
growth,
is as part of a global, is as part of a comprehensive. Well, can I have my say?
You let Senator Cormann, please, because if we're all talking over each other, it's ridiculous. Senator Cormann, please.
Thank you, Kieran. The best time for Australia to go down this sort of path is as part of an appropriately comprehensive global framework. If our competitors, the US, China, were to go down this path, then of course, we would have to have a different conversation. But for Australia to put a price on carbon and make us less competitive internationally, so that higher polluting businesses in other parts of the world can take market share away from manufacturing businesses here in Australia, just doesn't make sense. And people across Australia understand that it doesn't make sense. And if Julia Gillard thought it was such a good idea, why didn't she tell the Australian people before the last election that that was her plan? Why did she tell people that there will be no carbon tax under a government she leads? The reason she said that is because she knew that this is a deeply unpopular tax, that this is a tax people across Australia know is bad for the economy while not doing anything for the environment.
Okay, well, David, on the cost of living issues, which I know in your area in Lindsay at the foot of the Blue Mountains in Sydney, it's biting there, it's biting a lot of places around Australia. With the power price rise, people are going to see the component of the carbon tax as well as the cost of upgrading poles and wires and so on. But the fact is, they're still going to be out of pocket, aren't they, at the end of the day? Because the carbon tax might be compensated, but then you've got these other costs on top. It just adds to the woes.
And the reality is, Kieran, that under a Liberal government proposing to do nothing to transition us to a clean energy future, under a Liberal government with no plan to secure our energy needs into the future, you would still have increases in power prices. In fact, it was really interesting that Matthias has given the state government such a leave pass on this issue. Take the Western Australian government, the state from which Matthias comes. Now, 57% is what power prices have increased over the last 3 years. Now, you can't blame the carbon price for that. And in fact, what compensation has the West Australian government given? In New South Wales over the last 3 years, it's been more than 50%. These are increases being driven in large part by various regulatory arrangements that state governments have in place. No compensation. What we are doing is about trying to ensure that we have a stronger economy in the future, that as an economy we on the one hand take into account the environmental needs of tackling climate change, but that we prepare our economy to start to move away from its reliance upon fossil fuels to the great extent that currently exists. Now, if we don't do that, then the cost will increase. But this government is tackling this issue by providing compensation. Other cost increases don't have any compensation.
Senator Cormann, an extension of the marine parks today, exemptions for exploration of the WA coast, off Margaret River, for example, Just a quick response, if I can. We're going to hear from Tony Burke a bit later, so I won't get David on this, but your response to this idea of exemptions when it comes to exploration of the coast, of WA, your state, for one.
What is going to be important here is that any decisions are based on science and that we don't have arbitrary decisions made out of Canberra. I mean, the coalition has got a very good track record when it comes to sensibly protecting important marine areas. We established the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, but of course we based our decisions on extensive consultation, both with the fishing and other relevant industries in the community, whereas we are quite concerned about the way Tony Burke has been approaching this. But of course there's got to be a sensible balance between ensuring that economic development can continue and the science of protecting important areas.
Senator Cormann and David Bradbury, great to see you both this morning, gentlemen. Thanks for that. We'll take a quick break and we'll be right back.